The chain on her ankle was real, but the true prison was invisible, built from fear, debt, and shattered hope. Of the estimated 40 million people trapped in modern slavery today, only 1% will ever be rescued. This is the story of what happens in that desperate, improbable moment when the bolt cutters snap and freedom becomes more terrifying than captivity. We're talking about human trafficking, a $236 billion global shadow economy that thrives on invisibility. The victim you pictured isn't just a statistic. She's one of millions whose identity, autonomy, and hope were systematically stripped away. But here is the central, haunting question the data cannot answer. What happens in the first raw hours after the cage door swings open? When the physical chains are gone, but the psychological ones tight? This is where most documentaries end. Ours begins. Meet Maya, 24 years old. Her story doesn't start with a chain, but with a promise. A modeling opportunity overseas, arranged by a man she met at a coffee shop who seemed genuinely invested in her future. This is how it begins for roughly 80% of trafficking victims, not with a violent abduction, but with a calculated offer of a better life. The fraud is so seamless, so tailored, that by the time the plane landed in a country where she didn't speak the language, the psychological cage was already locking shut. Her passport was confiscated for safekeeping. The luxurious apartment promised was a single filthy room shared with 5 other girls. The debt was presented to her on her first day, $20,000 for travel, housing, and agency fees. This is debt bondage, the most common control mechanism in modern slavery, trapping an estimated 16 million people worldwide. Every meal, every piece of clothing became another line item added to her insurmountable ledger. The work wasn't modeling. It was in a clandestine factory, 18 hours a day, assembling counterfeit electronics. The threat wasn't just against her, but against her younger brother back home, whose photo her captors made sure she saw every time her resolve flickered. This is the brutal economics of the trap. The trafficker's investment is minimal: a fake visa, a plane ticket, a squalid room. The return is astronomical. A single victim can generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. For 2 years, Maya's world shrank to the 4 walls of that factory floor and the adjacent kitchen where she slept. The chain on her ankle came later, a punishment for a failed escape attempt, a blunt message to the others. But the real innovation of her captors wasn't the physical restraint. It was the psychological architecture that made her believe, on some deep level, that she deserved this, that she had brought this upon herself by being naive. This internalized shame is the most durable prison of all. Meanwhile, in another world entirely, Agent Daniel Reyes of the Human Trafficking Task Force was piecing together a digital phantom. His target wasn't a lone smuggler, but a sophisticated network using freight shipping routes to move both goods and people. The break came not from a victim's testimony, but from a financial audit. A shell company registered to a vacant office showed impossible utility bills. The heat signature from a satellite, ordered by a judge, revealed a hidden industrial operation running all night in a supposedly abandoned warehouse district. Reyes wasn't planning a rescue. He was building a RICO case. The people inside were evidence. This disconnect is the first tragic flaw in the system. Law enforcement often pursues traffickers for the crimes of smuggling, money laundering, or racketeering. The victims are secondary, pieces on a prosecutorial chessboard. The official priority is to dismantle the network. Saving those trapped within it is a hoped-for byproduct, not the primary operational goal. For every dedicated vice unit, there are a dozen jurisdictions where trafficking is a low priority, buried under violent crime and narcotics. The result? That staggering 1% rescue rate. The raid on the warehouse was timed for 4 a.m., a time of maximum fatigue and minimal resistance. It was a tactical operation with breaching tools and flashbangs. Reyes' team flowed in, securing the stunned overseers. And then he saw her. Maya, hunched on a thin mattress in the kitchen, the chain tethering her to a rusted pipe, looking not at her rescuers but at the floor as if this were just another test. The bolt cutters he carried were standard issue for these operations, meant for padlocked doors and containers. Kneeling before her to cut the ankle cuff felt, in that moment, like the most profound and insufficient gesture in the world. The first words spoken to her in 2 years that weren't a command or a threat were his. "You're safe now. My name is Daniel. I'm with the police." She didn't react. This is traumatic dissociation, a survival mechanism where the mind simply cannot process the shift from extreme danger to perceived safety. The brain stays in the survival loop. For Maya, this man in a suit kneeling before her wasn't a savior. He was a new variable in a hostile equation. Would he want payment? Would he return her to the bosses? The concept of unconditional rescue had been systematically erased from her psyche. The processing center was a sterile government building. Blankets, medical checks, a hot meal she couldn't keep down. This is the standard post-rescue protocol, immediate physical needs. But here, the second systemic flaw gapes wide. The average victim requires 18 to 24 months of intensive, specialized therapy to begin recovering from the complex trauma of trafficking. The state-funded program Maya was entered into offered 12 counseling sessions. 12. After which she would be issued a temporary visa, some basic life skills pamphlets, and released. The system is designed to process, not to heal. It acknowledges the crime against the body, but is unequipped to address the murder of the self. This is where Agent Reyes made a decision that would fracture his professional protocol. He saw the files. He knew the math. 12 sessions versus 2 years of hell. A temporary visa leading to probable homelessness, which is the recruiting ground for traffickers. He saw a high-value witness who could identify the network's inner logistics, but he also saw a person about to be failed by the very system that had just cut her free. So he came to her with an offer. Not in an interrogation room, but in the quiet cafeteria of the shelter. He laid out the brutal calculus. The network was wounded but not dead. Its leaders were still out there. They knew her face. They considered her a liability. The standard victim protection was a joke, a new city and a hope they wouldn't find her. But he had another path. A federal witness protection pipeline reserved for those who could deliver decisive testimony. It meant a new identity, a secure location, sustained financial and psychological support. But the price was steep. She would have to go back in, not as a slave, but as a cooperator. Wear a wire. Help them build an ironclad case from the inside. It was the only way to guarantee her long-term safety by destroying the people who wanted her dead. He was asking her to voluntarily re-enter the nightmare with a hidden lifeline, to trade the certainty of a broken system for the perilous chance to break her captors forever. The choice was impossible, a slow-motion decline into vulnerability or a high-stakes gamble with her life as the wager. She had just tasted freedom for 48 hours. Now, the man who had cut the chain was asking her to hand him back the key. Maya said yes, not with words but with a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The calculus of trauma had been performed in the silent circuitry of her brain. The known terror of the past was somehow preferable to the unknown terror of an unanchored future. In that moment, she wasn't choosing bravery. She was choosing the devil she knew, but this time with a wire and a prayer. Agent Reyes had just recruited the most vulnerable confidential informant in the Bureau's history. The preparation was a crash course in controlled terror. For 2 weeks, in a safe house that felt more like a laboratory, a forensic psychologist drilled her on maintaining a trauma state baseline. She couldn't appear healed. She couldn't show the flicker of hope that genuine rescue might spark. She had to project the same broken demeanor, the 1,000-yard stare, the learned helplessness that had been her armor for 2 years. The technical team fitted her with a nanofiber wire, thinner than a thread, woven into the seam of the same dirty dress she was rescued in. The audio transmitter was a subcutaneous implant behind her ear, activated by the pressure of a specific tooth. Bite down to record. Bite twice to signal immediate extraction. This was the lifeline. The cover story was agonizingly simple. She had escaped during the police raid's chaos, hid in the city's underbelly, and was now returning to the only structure she knew, begging for forgiveness and work. It was plausible because it happened often. Traffickers count on the psychological imprisonment being stronger than physical freedom. They rely on the fact that a victim, stripped of resources and identity, will often voluntarily return to their captor, a phenomenon known as traumatic bonding. Maya was banking on their arrogance. The drop-off was at midnight in a derelict industrial park. No farewells, no reassurances. Reyes looked at her from the driver's seat of an unmarked car, his professional detachment fraying at the edges. "Remember the signal," was all he said. She slid out into the damp cold and walked, alone, toward the designated warehouse door. Each step was a seismic event in her nervous system. This was the point of no return. The door opened before she could knock. A man she recognized as a mid-level enforcer, Leonid, stared at her with pure astonishment that curdled into suspicion. Her performance was a masterpiece of devastating authenticity. She didn't have to act broken. She had to restrain the part of her that had begun to hope. She spoke in a monotone, reciting her rehearsed lines about being scared, hungry, and having nowhere else to go. She flinched when he reached for her, a reflex that was tragically genuine. Leonid's response was not compassion but a cold efficiency. She was an asset that had wandered back onto the ledger. He took her inside. The first 48 hours were an audit of pain. She was isolated in a storage closet, questioned repeatedly by different men, her story poked and prodded for inconsistencies. The psychological torture was deliberate. Sleep deprivation, alternating silence and shouted accusations, the implied threat of violence just outside the door. This was their quality control process. Through it all, Maya held onto her trauma like a shield. She bit down on her tooth once, just to feel the faint hum of the transmitter, a tiny beacon in the overwhelming dark. She passed. Her reward was not freedom but a return to the factory floor. The chain was not reinstated. She had proven her compliance by returning. This was the subtle upgrade in her prison. The control was now presumed to be internal. Her old spot was waiting for her. The other women, faces she knew, looked at her with a hollow confusion that broke her heart. They couldn't understand why anyone would come back. She was now an outsider among outsiders. Her mission was threefold: identify the hierarchy above Leonid, map the money-moving channels, and capture verbal evidence of coercion and debt bondage. The wire picked up everything: the foreman's threats, the detailed accounting of inflated debts, the casual discussions of moving shipments of new girls. She was a living, breathing data node in the heart of the operation, but the human cost was apocalyptic. She had to stand by, silently recording, as a new girl no older than 17 was broken in with threats against her family. Maya's mandate was to observe, not to intervene. Every night, the guilt etched itself deeper into her soul. Then the pivot. A week in, a man she'd never seen arrived. He was older, dressed not in work clothes but in an expensive, understated sweater. He moved through the factory with the quiet authority of ownership. Leonid trailed behind him, uncharacteristically deferential. The man, who the others called the accountant, didn't look at the workers as people but as inventory. Maya, biting her tooth, heard him tell Leonid the operation was being consolidated. They were moving the most valuable assets, the younger, more resilient women, to a new location for higher-yield contracts. The factory was to be liquidated. The implied fate of those not deemed valuable hung in the air, unspoken but understood. This was the major revelation. The network wasn't just a single operation. It was a franchise, with assets being coldly moved between ventures based on profit potential. Taking down this warehouse would be like clipping a single branch from a vast, deep-rooted tree. The real target was the man who managed the portfolio, the accountant. Maya's signal to Reyes was urgent. The extraction plan was predicated on a stable location. A move would make her unrecoverable. The response that came through her concealed earpiece during a bathroom break was tense. "We need a name, a destination, anything. Without it, we lose him." The pressure cooker exploded the next day. A routine delivery turned into a chaotic argument. The delivery driver, angry about being shorted on payment, shouted a name neither Maya nor the FBI had ever heard. Koslov will hear about this, Koslov. The name electrified the task force. Cross-referencing in real time, they found a ghost, a Latvian national with suspected ties to transnational organized crime, long wanted but never seen. The accountant worked for Koslov. This was no longer a local trafficking case. It was an international conspiracy. Maya had the golden thread, but in pulling it, she alerted the spider. The accountant, paranoid by profession, ordered a sweeping electronic counter-surveillance sweep of the premises that afternoon. The devices they used were military-grade, designed to detect even the most sophisticated transmitters. As the technician moved closer to her workstation, the smooth plastic wand in his hand emitting a soft, searching whine, Maya's blood turned to ice. The subcutaneous implant behind her ear, believed to be undetectable, carried a microscopic power signature, a signature that scanner was designed to find. She was seconds from exposure. The technician was 2 workstations away. Her mind raced not towards escape but towards the catastrophic failure of the mission. If discovered, they would torture her for what she knew, dismantle the entire investigation and disappear every victim into a deeper, darker hole. She had no weapon, no exit. All she had was the wire and the man on the other end listening to her impending doom. She bit down on her tooth twice in rapid succession, the distress signal. In her ear she heard Reyes' voice, strained and immediate. Maya, status, report. She couldn't speak. She could only breathe, shallow and fast, directly into the microphone as the scanner's whine grew louder, a digital siren announcing the end of everything. The technician stepped to the woman next to her. The wand passed over the woman's ragged clothing. A green light, clear, he turned. His eyes met Maya's. He took a step forward. The scanner passed over her. The whine pitched higher, a strained electronic squeal. The technician's eyes dropped to the device's screen, a flicker, not a solid red detection light but an intermittent amber glitch. He frowned, tapped the scanner and passed it over her again. The amber flicker persisted. Maya's entire existence narrowed to that tiny, unreliable light. In her ear, Reyes' voice was a harsh whisper. Do not move. Do not speak. The technician called over his supervisor. This one's giving a dirty signal. Interference. Could be a metal fragment in the old walls or, he didn't finish the thought. The supervisor, a man with cold eyes, looked from the scanner to Maya's petrified face. His solution was not technological but brutal. Search her. Thoroughly. This was the contingency they hadn't fully planned for. The wire itself was undetectable, but a physical search would find the tiny, healed incision behind her ear. She was pulled into a side office. As rough hands pushed her against a wall, the mission's delicate architecture crumbled. She was going to be found, and then she would be made to talk. The only question was how long she could last before she gave them Reyes, the safe house, everything. But then a sound, not from inside the warehouse but from outside. A distant, percussive thump followed by the sudden roar of engines and the shriek of tires on gravel. The supervisor's head snapped toward the window. What is that? The distraction was absolute. The hands holding her loosened. Through the grimy window, they saw black SUVs plowing through the chain-link fence, doors flying open before the vehicles even stopped. This wasn't the FBI. Reyes' extraction plan was a silent, surgical pullout. This was a military-style assault. The men spilling from the SUVs wore tactical gear without insignia. The supervisor's radio erupted with panicked shouts from the front. We're hit. Armed response. It's not the police. Chaos swallowed the warehouse. The supervisor forgot about Maya, shoving her back toward the main floor as he drew a weapon and ran toward the breach. The factory descended into bedlam. Overseers scrambled for weapons or escape routes. The other women workers dropped to the floor, covering their heads. Maya was caught in the turbulent center, the wire still active, transmitting the cacophony of a completely unforeseen third act. In her ear, Reyes' voice was now edged with raw alarm. Maya, report. What is happening? We do not have teams moving in. Repeat, those are not our people. Then she saw him. Through the smoke and confusion, the accountant emerged from a back office, not panicking but furious. He grabbed Leonid and shouted a phrase in Russian that the wire picked up cleanly. Koslov's cleanup crew, they're sterilizing the site. The meaning was chilling. This assault wasn't a rescue. It was a corporate liquidation. Koslov, the ghost, had been alerted by the security sweep and had sent his own paramilitary team to erase the compromised operation, evidence, witnesses, and all. The new forces moved with horrifying efficiency. They weren't rounding people up. They were neutralizing them. Overseers were shot on sight. The accountant and Leonid were being forcibly but purposefully escorted toward the back. They were assets to be preserved. The workers, the women, were liabilities to be disposed of. Maya saw a masked gunman raise his weapon toward a huddled group of women. The mission was over. Survival was the only objective. She bit down on her tooth twice again, the panic signal. "They're killing everyone," she hissed into the wire, her voice lost in the gunfire and screams. Ray's response was instantaneous and transformed. The professional detachment shattered. "Maya, listen to me. Get to the north wall, the loading bay door. Do you see it? There is a small emergency exit to the left of it, a red handle. Our backup is 5 minutes out. You have to make it to that door. 5 minutes." 5 minutes was a lifetime in a killing floor. Using the chaos as cover, she crawled, then ran, keeping low between machinery. A gunman spotted her, shouted. She ducked as a spray of bullets tore into the conveyor belt above her head. She wasn't a spy anymore. She was prey. She reached the north wall, her breath sawing in her lungs. The red handle was there, 20 feet away, across an open stretch of concrete, exposed. This was the wait, it gets worse moment. The entire operation had been hijacked by a more powerful, more ruthless enemy. The evidence she'd gathered was about to be destroyed in a bloodbath. The man who sent her in was powerless to stop it. And the exit, her only hope, was a suicide sprint across a kill zone. She gathered herself. Then a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, yanking her into a shadowy alcove. She struggled, expecting a gunman's grip. Instead, she found herself staring into the terrified face of Anya, one of the younger girls from the factory floor. "The door is trapped," Anya whispered in broken English, her eyes wide. "They always said, if anyone runs, the door blows." Maya's blood froze, of course. The exit for the merchandise was always controlled. The red handle wasn't salvation, it was a trigger. Ray's intelligence was fatally incomplete. The entire extraction plan was a death sentence. In her ear, Ray's was counting down. 3 minutes, Maya, get ready to move on my mark. He had no idea. She had seconds to decide. Trust the trap door or find another way. She looked at Anya, then at the panicked girls still huddled on the floor. The mission parameters dissolved. This was no longer about testimony or taking down Koslov. It was about the women in the room. She made a choice. She grabbed Anya's hand and pulled her toward a different part of the wall, a large, rusted metal grate covering an old ventilation shaft she'd noted weeks ago. It was bolted shut, but the metal was corroded. Using a piece of broken machinery as a lever with Anya's help, she pried at the rust-weakened bolts. One gave way with a shriek of metal. The sound attracted attention. A masked gunman turned, raising his weapon. Time dilated. Maya heaved at the grate. A second bolt snapped. The grate swung open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. She shoved Anya into it. "Go, crawl and don't stop." She then turned back to the main floor and did the one thing she was never supposed to do. She broke cover completely. She stood up and screamed at the top of her lungs, not in English but in the native tongue of most of the women. "The grate, the vent, now, run," she pointed frantically. For a split second, the gunmen were confused, their focus split. That second was enough. A wave of desperate movement surged toward the alcove. Maya became a shepherd of chaos, pulling women toward the opening, shoving them into the duct. The gunfire redirected toward her position. Bullets sparked off the metal around her. She was the last one at the entrance. As she turned to dive into the shaft, a searing pain exploded in her side. She didn't hear the shot, only felt the impact, like being hit by a sledgehammer. She tumbled into the darkness, the grate slamming shut behind her from the force of the fall. The world compressed to pain, darkness, and the sound of frantic crawling ahead of her. The wire was still live. Ray's voice was a distant, frantic buzz. She couldn't respond. She could only crawl, one hand pressed against the warm, wet wound in her side, following the faint sounds of the others. The ventilation shaft led down, then turned, then opened into a storm drain that emptied into a creek bed behind the industrial complex. One by one, bleeding, terrified women spilled out into the cold night air. 7 of them. Maya was the last. She collapsed onto the muddy bank, the world spinning. The women gathered around her, unsure what to do. They were free but utterly lost. The sound of sirens, real police sirens this time, finally cut through the night. Ray's backup, arriving to a scene of massacre and an empty ventilation shaft. Maya's hand fumbled for the wire. With her last conscious strength, she bit down once. A final transmission, then darkness. She awoke in a hospital, not a safe house. The room was secure, an armed guard outside her door. The wound was a through and through, missing anything vital but devastatingly painful. Agent Reyes was sitting in a chair by her bed, his face etched with a fatigue deeper than exhaustion. He waited for her eyes to focus. "You saved 7 lives," he said, his voice rough. "The warehouse is a charnel house. The accountant and Leonid are gone, so is Koslov's cleanup crew. They vanished, but we have everything. The wire kept transmitting until the battery died in the drain. We have the name Koslov. We have the liquidation order. We have the whole thing." But his expression held no victory. "The women you saved, they're being processed as material witnesses. They'll get the visas, the support, because of you." He paused, the weight of the next words settling in the sterile air. "But you, Maya, you're not a witness anymore. You're a direct participant in an act of war against a transnational syndicate. Koslov knows your face. He knows you cost him an operation and exposed him. The standard protection, it doesn't exist for what you're up against." He leaned forward. "The chain is off your ankle, but I need you to understand. You just swapped it for a target on your back, and the only way to remove it is to finish what we started, not from the inside, from the top." From the top. That meant becoming a ghost in the machine of her own life. The Federal Witness Protection Program, known as WITSEC, had a tier so classified it didn't have a public name. Maya entered it. Her old identity was declared deceased in a hospital database. A new name, a new history, a new face, subtle surgical adjustments that changed her profile just enough. She was relocated to a safe house in a quiet European city, not to hide, but to be used as bait in a global trap. The strategy was audacious. Using the financial trails the accountant had unwittingly revealed, international agencies froze over $40 million in assets linked to Koslov across 12 countries. The pressure was designed to force him out of the shadows. He would need to move, to communicate, to consolidate. And when he did, they would be listening. Maya's role was to become a digital phantom, a curated leak within the underworld's rumor mill. Through carefully controlled channels, a story spread. A key witness from the warehouse raid had been given a new life in a specific city, under a specific new name. The information was just credible enough, just specific enough to be irresistible. She was the staked goat. For 6 months, she lived a paradox. In a comfortable apartment, she was both prisoner and protagonist. She took online courses in psychology, a field chosen not for a career, but to understand her own shattered mind. She had a dedicated trauma therapist, a luxury the system had previously denied her. The healing was agonizingly slow. The guilt for the women she couldn't save was a stone in her stomach. The fear of a knock at the door was a constant hum in her nervous system. This was the reality of protection, a life of suspended animation, waiting for a predator to take the bait. The trap sprang not in her city, but in Riga, Latvia. Koslov, feeling the financial vice tighten, made a fatal mistake. He attempted to broker a face-to-face meeting with a corrupt official to move a frozen sum. The meeting was in a luxury hotel suite, wired by Europol. The arrest was quiet, efficient, and devoid of the cinematic violence of the warehouse. The man who had been a ghost was just a tired, middle-aged financier in a tailored suit, utterly bewildered by the handcuffs. The takedown made no headlines. The extradition process would take years, but the network, severed from its head, began to disintegrate. For Maya, the news came from Reyes, who visited her safe house one last time. The target was officially removed. The mission was over. But then came the moment of truth. The system presented her with a choice. She could take her new identity and disappear forever into a normal life, with a substantial financial settlement for her cooperation. Or she could do something unprecedented. Reyes laid out a proposal from a coalition of non-governmental organizations. They wanted to build a new kind of recovery program, one designed by survivors for survivors. They needed someone who understood the trauma, the systemic gaps, and the brutal economics of the trade to help design it. It would mean stepping out of the shadows, not as Maya, but as a new public advocate. It would mean facing the world and her past. It was the harder path by every measure. She chose the harder path. The program they built was called The Bridge. It rejected the old model of 12 sessions and a pamphlet. The Bridge was a 2-year residential program that combined intensive trauma therapy, using modalities like EMDR and somatic experiencing, with practical life skills education, legal advocacy, and critically, vocational training in high-demand fields like digital marketing and coding. It treated survivors not as victims to be processed, but as entrepreneurs of their own futures. The funding came from a novel source, a portion of the assets seized from Koslov's network, legally redirected through a victims' restitution fund. The traffickers' money was literally funding their victims' recovery. Maya, under her new public identity as Alina, became the program's director of peer support. The 7 women she saved from the warehouse, each at different stages of their own healing, became the first cohort. The first year was tumultuous. Nightmares, panic attacks, regressions, but also breakthroughs. The first time one of the women, Anya, laughed unself-consciously at a movie. The day another passed her high school equivalency exam. These were the victories that mattered. The final, surprising detail emerged from the data. After 3 years, the Bridge's recidivism rate, the rate at which survivors fell back into vulnerable situations or were re-trafficked, was 0. Not 1%. 0. In contrast, traditional programs saw recidivism rates as high as 30% within the first year. The model worked because it addressed the core truth. Rescue is not an event, but a years-long process of rebuilding a person's agency, trust, and economic independence. The story ends not with a fairy tale, but with a foundation. Maya will never be the person she was before the coffee shop offer. The psychological scars are permanent landmarks on her internal map, but they are no longer open wounds. The chain was cut, the target removed, but the most important liberation was the one she forged for herself and others, the freedom to not just survive, but to build. She turned her captivity into a blueprint for freedom, and in doing so, she redefined what rescue actually means. The bolt cutters snap once. The rebuilding takes a lifetime. So what does Maya's story tell us about that 1%? The tiny fraction who make it out of the shadow economy. It reveals a brutal truth. Rescue is not a destination. It is the first, fragile step on a decades-long journey. The chain on the ankle is the simplest problem to solve. The real work begins after the bolt cutters fall silent. For every Maya, there are 99 others whose stories we will never hear. Their captivity persists not because of a lack of law enforcement raids, but because of a surplus of systemic failures, underfunded victim services, patchwork legal protections, and a global economy that still profits from disposable human labor. The $236 billion figure isn't just revenue, it's a measurement of our collective indifference. Maya's legacy, the Bridge program, offers a blueprint, not a fairy tale. It proves that recovery is possible when we invest in the whole person, not just process the crime. It shows that the most powerful tool against trauma isn't just therapy, but agency, the ability to craft a future that isn't defined by the past. But blueprints require builders. This is the lingering question her story leaves with us. We applaud the heroic rescue, the dramatic takedown, but who champions the unglamorous, years-long work of healing? Who funds the second year of therapy, the vocational training, the safe housing? As a society, our attention span for suffering is tragically short. The documentary ends. The credits roll. For the survivor, the real movie is just beginning. The final, unsettling perspective is this. The chain you pictured in the hook was a symbol. The real chains are the policies we fail to pass, the services we fail to fund, and the uncomfortable truths we choose to look away from. Breaking those requires more than a single hero with a tool. It requires a shift in priority, from seeing